Did you know that during the London Blitz, more than 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged? Or that for 57 nights in a row, the city was attacked? It's a number that's hard to imagine. But what was it really like? We see the famous pictures, the ones in black and white. A cathedral standing strong against smoke. A milkman on his round in the rubble. They tell a story, but not the whole story. What did the air smell like? What was the real sound of a siren, not the one in the movies? How did you make a cup of tea when your kitchen wall was gone? These photos are clues. They are fragments of a life that was both terrifying and strangely normal. They show us people trying to live, not just survive. They raise questions. How do you keep a city running when it's being broken apart every night? How do you go to work, raise children, or fall in love? This isn't just about history, it's about people. People who were cold, tired, scared, and sometimes even bored. Let's look past the grainy images and try to understand what it felt like to be there. Number 21. Why did the milkman keep delivering? You've probably seen the photo. A man in a white coat carrying a metal crate of milk bottles. He steps carefully. All around him are piles of bricks and splintered wood. A building has collapsed, but he is a milkman. And this is his round. The photo is famous. His name was Fred Morley. He wasn't a real milkman in a way. The photo was staged by a photographer named Herbert Mason on the morning of October 10th, 1940. He wanted a picture that showed London's spirit. But the thing is, it wasn't a lie. It was a true fiction, because milkmen really did keep delivering. So did postmen, so did bus drivers. The city had to keep moving. The government knew this was critical. The Ministry of Food, led by Lord Woolton, worked hard to make sure supply chains didn't break. They organized emergency food convoys. They set up temporary distribution centers. If a bakery was hit, flour would be rerouted to another one. The goal was simple when people woke up. There had to be bread and milk. It was a promise that things were not completely falling apart. A study of civilian morale conducted by the Ministry of Information found that the continuation of these simple services had a massive psychological impact. It was a sign of order in the middle of chaos. The people doing these jobs weren't soldiers. They were ordinary men and women. They faced the same dangers as everyone else. A bus driver might have to navigate a route that looked completely different from the day before. A postman might be delivering a letter to a house that no longer existed. The General Post Office, or GPO, reported that dozens of its workers were killed on duty during this period. Yet, they had a motto: the mail must get through. And it usually did. They created a system of mobile post offices and temporary sorting facilities. They worked in damaged buildings, sometimes with no roof. This idea of carrying on was documented extensively by the Mass Observation Project. This was a social research organization where volunteers kept diaries and observers wrote down what they saw and heard in everyday life. The records from 1940 and 1941 are filled with small details, people complaining about the taste of their tea, but being glad they could get it at all. A woman in Stepney writing in her diary about her relief when the baker's cart arrived on time. These small routines became anchors. They were something to hold on to when everything else was uncertain. The historian Angus Calder wrote a book called The Myth of the Blitz, where he argued that the popular image of a cheerful, united London was partly a creation of propaganda. He showed that people were often angry, scared, and selfish. But he also acknowledged that this determination to do the job, to deliver the milk, was very real. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about doing the one thing you knew how to do. What was the real rate of absenteeism for essential workers, and how was it covered up? How many postmen and milkmen suffered from severe, undocumented psychological stress? Were there secret government plans to use the army to deliver food if the civilian system completely broke down? Number 20, how do you sleep on a train platform? A photograph from the time shows a London Underground platform, but it's not for waiting for a train. It's a bedroom. Rows of people are lying down, some are on makeshift bunk beds, some are just on blankets on the hard concrete. A woman is reading a book. A child is sleeping. This was a nightly reality for tens of thousands of Londoners. The government didn't plan it. In fact, they were against it at first. When the heavy bombing started in September 1940, people naturally sought the safest place they could think of, deep underground. They started showing up at tube stations with blankets and pillows. At first, the authorities tried to stop them. They worried about hygiene. They worried about interfering with the train service. They put up gates. But people just bought a ticket and refused to leave. The pressure was enormous. Within weeks, the government had to change its mind. They had to accept that the tube was now a public shelter. It was an incredible feat of improvisation. Transport officials, led by the chairman of the London Passenger Transport Board, Lord Ashfield, had to figure it out on the fly. They installed thousands of bunk beds, over 22,000 of them. They set up first aid posts. They ran special trains called tube refreshment specials that would travel along the lines at night, delivering tea, cocoa, and sandwiches. They installed chemical toilets, though sanitation was always a problem. The smell in the tunnels was a mix of sweat, disinfectant, and damp earth. And a survey from the time found that about 177,000 people were sleeping in the tube each night at the peak. And life down there developed its own culture. A sense of community formed. People would try to claim the same spot every night. They formed shelter committees to organize things and resolve disputes. There was entertainment. Impromptu sing-alongs were common. The pianist Myra Hess even began performing concerts in the National Gallery during the day, a similar effort to keep culture alive, but at night, the music was in the tunnels. However, it wasn't a happy holiday camp. It was often crowded and noisy. People snored, children cried, and there was always the fear. The tunnels muffled the sounds from above, but you could still feel the vibrations when a heavy bomb landed nearby. The worst tragedy related to the shelters happened at Bethnal Green Station on March 3rd, 1943. It wasn't a direct hit. A new anti-aircraft rocket was tested nearby, making an unfamiliar loud noise. People panicked and rushed to get into the station entrance. Someone slipped on the wet stairs, and a chain reaction caused 173 people, mostly women and children, to be crushed. The event was censored at the time to avoid damaging morale. It was a dark reminder that even the places of safety were not truly safe. The social scientist Richard Titmuss, in his official history, Problems of Social Policy, wrote about the immense psychological strain on civilians and how the shelter system was a response to a deep, primal need for security, however imperfect. How many people suffered from long-term respiratory illnesses because of the poor air quality in the tunnels? What was the true extent of crime and conflict in the shelters that went unreported? Were there any secret, much deeper tunnels reserved only for government officials that the public never knew about? Number 19, what did a bombed-out library smell like? There is a striking image of three men in a London library, or what's left of it. The roof is gone, the sky is visible above them, and the piles of rubble litter the floor. But the bookshelves along the walls are somehow still standing, full of books. The men are browsing. One pulls a book from a shelf, looking at it calmly. This was Holland House Library in Kensington, pictured in October 1940. It captures a strange moment of peace in the middle of destruction. It asks a question: when the world is being torn apart, what is the point of a book? For many, the answer was everything. Books and learning were a form of resistance, an act of defiance. The idea was that you could destroy buildings, but not ideas. Libraries across London made a huge effort to stay open. The Westminster City Council, for example, reported that their public libraries had more patrons than ever before. People wanted distraction. They wanted to escape into a story. But they also wanted information. There was a huge demand for books on gardening, home repairs, and technical manuals for war work. The destruction of books was a painful reality. On the night of December 29, 1940, a massive incendiary raid hit the area around St. Paul's Cathedral. This part of London, called Paternoster Row, was the heart of the British publishing industry. Millions of books were destroyed in the fires. The writer and publisher J.B. Priestley gave a famous radio broadcast a few days later, mourning the loss. He described the acres of books turned to ash. He said it was an attack on the printed word, on the human record. It wasn't just paper, it was our collective memory. A huge effort was made to save what could be saved. The government launched a national book recovery and salvage campaign. People were asked to donate old books. Some were pulped to make paper for the war effort, which was in short supply, but teams of librarians and volunteers worked to identify and save valuable or important books from the donations and from bombed-out libraries. It was a massive literary rescue operation. Organizations like the London Library, a private subscription library, suffered direct hits but were determined to continue. After a bomb hit the London Library in 1944, staff and members formed human chains to rescue books from the wreckage. This focus on culture wasn't limited to books. Theaters in the West End closed at first, but many reopened, offering earlier shows that would finish before the blackout and the evening raids. The government sponsored lunchtime concerts at the National Gallery. The Council for the Encouragement of Music and Arts, CEMA, a forerunner of the Arts Council, was founded in 1940. Its goal was to bring music, art, and theater to people all over the country, especially in factories and shelters. The thinking, as documented in CEMA's founding papers, was that art wasn't a luxury, it was essential for morale. It reminded people what they were fighting to preserve: a world of creativity, knowledge, and free thought. What was the exact number of books destroyed in London, and what priceless manuscripts were lost forever? Did secret government departments try to rescue specific scientific or intelligence-related books before anything else? Were there underground networks of book collectors who looted rare volumes from damaged libraries and private collections? Number 18, did children think it was a game? Look at a photo of children from this time. They are on a train platform. They have small suitcases. A cardboard box containing a gas mask is slung over their shoulder. Each child has a label pinned to their coat like a piece of luggage. They are smiling for the camera, but their eyes tell a different story. They are evacuees. This was Operation Pied Piper. It was one of the biggest social experiments in British history. Starting on September 1st, 1939, just before the war began, the government began to evacuate children, pregnant women, and some disabled people from the big cities. The idea was to move them to smaller towns and villages in the countryside, the reception areas, where they would be safe from the expected bombing. In the first 3 days, nearly 1.5 million people were moved. It was an organizational miracle, but it was a human and social mess. The children had no idea where they were going. They were just told to show up at school with a packed bag. They were herded onto trains and buses and sent off. When they arrived in the countryside, they were lined up in a village hall or a school. Local people, the volunteer hosts, would come and pick them out. It was often a humiliating process. The stronger, healthier-looking children were chosen first. This experience was documented in many memoirs like Carrie's War by Nina Bodden, which, although fiction, was based on her own experiences as an evacuee. The culture clash was immense. The city children were often poorer. Some arrived with lice or skin conditions like impetigo. They spoke with different accents. They had never seen a cow. The country hosts were sometimes shocked by their table manners or their language. The social theorist Anna Freud, who ran a clinic in London during the war, studied the psychological effects on these children. Along with her colleague Dorothy Burlingham, she published studies like War and Children. They found that the separation from their parents was often more traumatic for the children than the fear of the bombs. Many children became withdrawn or started bedwetting, but it wasn't all bad. For some city children, the countryside was a revelation. The fresh air, good food, the freedom to run around in fields. Some formed deep and lasting bonds with their host families. And the evacuation had a profound effect on British society. It exposed the deep class divisions and the poverty that existed in the cities to the more affluent countryside. The shock of seeing the condition of some of the evacuees was a major factor in the public support for the creation of the welfare state and the National Health Service after the war. The historian Juliet Gardner, in her book, The Children's War, explores these complex social dynamics in great detail. Many children eventually drifted back to London. They missed their families. The predicted heavy bombing didn't happen right away in the period known as the Funny War. But when the Blitz began in September 1940, a second wave of evacuations began, this time more desperate. The children who stayed in London had a different experience. They learned to identify the sound of different planes. They collected shrapnel. For them, the ruins were a playground. It was a strange, terrifying, and sometimes exciting childhood. How many evacuee children suffered from abuse that was never reported? What was the true percentage of children who ran away from their host families to try and get back to London. Did the government secretly track the long-term psychological outcomes of the evacuees to measure the success of the program? Number 17. What does a siren really sound like? There are no photos of the sound, but every picture of life during the Blitz has a soundtrack, and the main track is the air raid siren. It was a sound that defined the era. It wasn't just a noise, it was a physical feeling. It started with a low moan and rose to a piercing, wavering scream. It meant drop everything, find shelter. Now, the all clear was a different sound, a steady, continuous note. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. The system was called the Air Raid Warning System. It was a network of about 1,800 sirens in London, placed on top of tall buildings. They were controlled remotely from a central command. The goal was to give people a few minutes warning. The system was triggered when spotters or early warning systems detected incoming enemy aircraft. Sir John Anderson, the Home Secretary, was in charge of civilian defense, and this system was a key part of his strategy. The effectiveness of the sirens is debated by historians. Sometimes they went off and no bombs fell. Sometimes the bombs fell before the siren sounded. This led to a kind of psychological exhaustion. People became numb to it. The sound changed people's behavior. The mass observation diaries are full of descriptions of what people did the moment they heard it. A cup of tea left half finished, a conversation cut short, the frantic search for a torch and a gas mask. People developed what became known as siren ears, an ability to hear the warning before others. They would stop in the middle of the street, head cocked, listening. After months of this, the sound became part of the normal rhythm of life. People learned to sleep through it, a dangerous habit. The psychological impact was studied at the time. A report by the Ministry of Home Security noted a condition they called siren sickness or siren jitters, a state of constant anxiety and nervousness. The constant alerts, day and night, shattered people's sense of safety and predictability. The government was worried about mass panic. They produced posters and films telling people to keep calm and carry on. The famous poster was actually part of a series of 3. The other 2, your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory, and freedom is in peril, were much more widely used. The sounds of the night were a terrifying symphony. First the siren, then the distant drone of aircraft engines getting louder. The rhythmic thumping of anti-aircraft guns, which Londoners nicknamed the London Philharmonic. The whistle of a falling bomb, a sound that many survivors said was the most terrifying of all. And then the crump of the explosion, a sound you felt in your chest as much as you heard with your ears. The silence after a bomb was just as scary. It was a silence filled with the tinkle of falling glass and the shouts of the air raid wardens. This soundscape of fear is something the black and white photos can never fully capture. How many people suffered permanent hearing damage from the sirens and explosions? Were there ever any major malfunctions in the siren system that left entire districts unwarned? Did psychologists secretly experiment with different siren sounds to see which caused the least panic? Number 16. Who were the people in the tin hats? In many photos of the Blitz you see them. Men and women in dark, heavy uniforms and round steel helmets. They are not soldiers. They are pointing at the sky or pulling a hose or helping someone out of a collapsed house. These were the members of the Civil Defense Services. They were the civilian army that fought the war on the home front. And they were mostly volunteers. The main group was the Air Raid Precautions, or ARP. The ARP warden was the most visible face of the civil defense. Their job was to patrol the streets during a raid. They enforced the blackout, shouting, "Put that light out," if they saw a chink of light from a window. They guided people to shelters, they reported bomb damage, and they were the first on the scene after a hit. They gave first aid, called for the rescue services, and dealt with the immediate aftermath. They carried a gas mask, a whistle, and a wooden rattle to warn of a gas attack. It was a dangerous, unpaid job. By 1940, there were over 1.5 million people in the ARP across Britain. Then there was the Auxiliary Fire Service, or AFS. These were volunteer firefighters. Before the war, London's fire brigade was not prepared for what was to come. The AFS massively expanded its numbers. These were men and women from all walks of life: shopkeepers, clerks, artists. They were given basic training and old equipment. They faced unimaginable conditions, especially during the big fire raids. The fires created their own weather systems with superheated winds sucking in oxygen and spreading the flames. The water mains were often broken by bombs, so they had to pump water from the Thames. The work was exhausting and incredibly dangerous. The writer and AFS fireman William Sansom wrote a collection of short stories called Fireman Flower, which gives a vivid, unsentimental account of what it was like. There were also the rescue squads, the ambulance drivers, the first aid parties. Women played a huge role in all of these services. The Mechaniced Transport Corps MTC was an all-female volunteer organization that provided drivers for ambulances and other vehicles. The Women's Voluntary Services WVS, led by the formidable Stella Isaacs, Marchioness of Reading, was a jack-of-all-trades organization. They ran mobile canteens for emergency workers, helped people who had been bombed out, collected scrap metal, and did 1,000 other jobs. The WVS was known for its green-gray uniform and its ability to produce a cup of tea in any circumstances. These volunteers were not immune to the stress. A Home Office report from 1941 noted the high levels of fatigue and psychological strain among ARP wardens. They saw terrible things. They had to go into shattered buildings, not knowing if they would collapse. They had to deal with casualties, but they kept doing it. The historian Tom Harrison, one of the founders of mass observation, noted that the shared danger and purpose created a powerful sense of camaraderie among the civil defense workers. They were ordinary people who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and discovered they were capable of things they never imagined. What was the true casualty rate for civil defense volunteers, and was it deliberately underreported to encourage recruitment? And how many volunteers quit because of psychological trauma? Were there secret loyalty checks done on ARP wardens to ensure they weren't spies or saboteurs? Number 15, how did you feed a family on an egg? A week. A photo shows a queue of women. They are standing outside a butcher's shop. They are holding shopping bags and purses. They look patient, but tired. This was a daily scene. The queue was a central part of life, and the reason was rationing. To ensure everyone got a fair share of limited supplies, the government introduced a system of rationing for food, clothing, and other goods. The system was run by the Ministry of Food. It began in January 1940 with bacon, butter, and sugar. It was gradually extended to meat, cheese, eggs, and many other things. Every person was issued with a ration book, full of coupons. To buy a rationed item, you had to hand over the right coupon along with the money. The weekly ration varied, but at one point it was something like this: about 4 ounces of bacon or ham, 2 ounces of butter, 8 ounces of sugar, 2 ounces of tea, and 1 shilling and 2 pence worth of meat, which was about a pound of the cheapest cuts. Fresh eggs were limited to 1 per person per week, if you were lucky. This forced a revolution in British cooking. The Ministry of Food launched a massive propaganda campaign to teach people how to make the most of their rations. They had a radio show called The Kitchen Front with characters like the Food Flashes announcer, who gave out tips and recipes. They created cartoon characters like Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete to encourage people to eat more vegetables which weren't rationed. The famous Woolton pie, named after the Minister of Food, was a vegetable pie with a potato crust. It was supposed to be a hearty, patriotic dish. Most people thought it was horrible. The diet was bland and monotonous. People missed a lot of things, especially sugar, fat, and fruit. But a surprising thing happened. According to medical studies conducted after the war, like the one published in the British Medical Journal in the late 1940s, the nation's health actually improved. Because everyone had access to a basic, if boring, diet. And because it was low in fat and sugar and high in vegetables, infant mortality fell and life expectancy rose. The rationing system, designed out of necessity, accidentally created one of the healthiest national diets in British history. Of course, there was a black market. You could get extra eggs or a piece of steak if you knew the right people and were willing to pay the price. The government cracked down hard on black marketeers with heavy fines and prison sentences, but for most people, life was about making do. They became experts at stretching ingredients. A small piece of meat would be bulked out with vegetables to make a stew that could last for days. Nothing was wasted. Leftover potato peelings were boiled up to feed the pigs. It was a constant daily challenge of ingenuity and patience. The queue was not just a place to get food, it was a place to exchange recipes, share news, and complain. What was the real scale of the black market, and how many high-level officials were secretly involved in it? Were there secret food depots with luxury goods reserved only for the political elite? How many people suffered from malnutrition because they didn't know how to cook with the limited ingredients or couldn't afford the unrationed vegetables? Number 14 was St. Paul's Cathedral deliberately spared. One of the most enduring images of the Blitz is of St. Paul's Cathedral. It is December 29th, 1940. The city around it is on fire. Smoke and flames fill the sky, but the dome of the cathedral stands intact, serene, and untouched. The photograph taken by Herbert Mason from the roof of the Daily Mail building became a powerful symbol of London's survival. But the survival of St. Paul's was not a miracle. It was the result of a deliberate, heroic effort. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had given a direct order. St. Paul's must be saved at all costs. He understood its importance to national morale. A special group of volunteer firefighters was created called the St. Paul's Watch. They were architects, artists, and clergymen who knew the cathedral intimately. Their leader was the surveyor to the fabric of the cathedral, W. Godfrey Allen. They trained for months, learning the layout of the vast building, its hidden passages, and its vulnerable points. On that night in December, often called the Second Great Fire of London, thousands of incendiary bombs were dropped on the city. The area around the cathedral was devastated. The St. Paul's Watch was on duty. They patrolled the roofs and the dome. They were equipped with sandbags, water pumps, and long-handled shovels. During the night, the cathedral was hit 28 times by incendiary bombs. One bomb lodged in the timber of the dome itself. It was in a place that was almost impossible to reach. A team of fire watchers had to climb up into the complex structure of the dome, find the burning bomb, and dislodge it so it could fall to the stone floor below and be extinguished. If they had failed, the dome would have caught fire and the entire cathedral would have been lost. This effort to protect cultural heritage was not unique to St. Paul's. Across London, museums and galleries had moved their most precious treasures to safety. The National Gallery moved its entire collection to a slate mine in Manad, Wales. The British Museum moved objects like the Elgin marbles and the Rosetta Stone to deep tube tunnels and country houses. This was a secret and massive operation that began even before the war started. The director of the National Gallery, Kenneth Clark, was instrumental in this effort. He argued that keeping the art safe was a national duty. The survival of St. Paul's had a huge impact. The day after the raid, the newspaper headlines declared, "St. Paul's stands." It gave people hope. It was a physical manifestation of their own resilience. It seemed to say that no matter what was thrown at them, the core of their city, their history, and their identity would endure. There is a persistent myth that the enemy pilots were ordered not to bomb the cathedral because it was a useful navigation point. While it certainly was a useful landmark, historical records from the attacking forces show no such order. In fact, the area was heavily targeted. The survival of St. Paul's was down to the planning, bravery, and determination of the men of the St. Paul's Watch. How many other significant historical buildings were secretly designated as expendable by the government? Was there a secret secondary team of fire watchers with orders to save specific documents or relics from the cathedral, even if it meant letting the main structure burn? Did any members of the St. Paul's Watch steal small artifacts during the chaos, and was this covered up? Number 13, how did you find your way in the dark? Imagine a city with no lights, no street lights, no lit up shop windows, no lights from houses. The only light is the moon, if it's not cloudy, and the sweeping beams of searchlights hunting for planes. This was the blackout. It was one of the first and most pervasive changes to everyday life. The rule was simple: no light could be visible from the outside. The idea was to make it harder for enemy bombers to find their targets at night. Every house had to have heavy blackout curtains or boards on the windows. ARP wardens would patrol the streets, and if they saw even a glimmer of light, they would shout and knock on the door until it was covered. This made life inside the house feel claustrophobic and stuffy, especially in the summer. Going outside at night was a challenge. People stumbled into things. They fell off curbs. They walked into lampposts. The number of road accidents soared. To help, the edges of curbs and the bumpers of cars were painted white. People were encouraged to wear something white or to leave their shirt tails hanging out just to be more visible. The blackout created a strange new geography of the city. You had to navigate by memory and touch. The city became a place of shadows and muffled sounds. It also led to an increase in crime. Pickpockets and muggers used the darkness to their advantage, but it also had some unexpected social effects. With nothing to do outside, people spent more time at home with their families. They listened to the radio. The BBC became a vital source of news and entertainment. Vera Lynn, the force's sweetheart, became a huge star with her songs of hope and longing. The darkness changed people's relationship with the sky. On a clear night, with no city lights, the stars were incredibly bright. But the sky was also a source of terror. The searchlights were a constant feature of the nightscape. Huge beams of light crisscrossing the sky, trying to lock onto an enemy plane so the anti-aircraft guns could take a shot. When a plane was caught in the beams, it looked like a tiny silver moth. Then you would see the flashes of the guns and the puffs of smoke from the exploding shells around it. The psychological effect of the constant darkness was significant. A study mentioned in Civilian Health and Medical Services, part of the official history of the war, noted a rise in symptoms of depression and anxiety, which some doctors linked to the lack of light and the feeling of being cooped up. The blackout was a constant physical reminder that they were at war. It was an oppressive, heavy blanket thrown over the entire city. And yet, people adapted. They developed a kind of night vision. They learned the sound of their neighbors' footsteps. Life went on, just in a much, much darker world. What was the true number of deaths and injuries caused by blackout-related accidents, and was it higher than the government admitted? Were there secret experiments using infrared technology to try and guide transport through the city at night? How extensive was the psychological damage caused by living in near total darkness for years? Number 12. Where did all of the animals go? There's a photo that's hard to look at. It's the entrance to a veterinary clinic. A long line of people are standing patiently. They are all holding their pets, dogs on leashes, cats in baskets. They are not there for a checkup. They are there to have their pets put down. This was the pet holocaust of 1939. It's a little known and tragic part of the story. When the war was declared, the government issued a public information leaflet. It was called Advice to Animal Owners. It suggested that if you couldn't move your pets to the countryside, it would be kindest to have them destroyed. The government was worried about a food shortage. They thought people wouldn't be able to feed their pets. They were also worried about what would happen to animals during an air raid. They feared that panicked animals would run wild in the streets or that injured pets would be a burden on resources. The public response was overwhelming and tragic. In the first week of the war, an estimated 750,000 British pets were killed by their owners. The animal charities like the RSPCA were swamped. They didn't have enough chloroform. It was a wave of mass hysteria driven by fear and a sense of duty. People thought they were doing the right thing, the responsible thing. Many of them were heartbroken. The historian Hilda Keane wrote a book called The Great Cat and Dog Massacre, which details this sad event. She argues it was based on a misunderstanding of the government's advice and a deep-seated fear of the unknown. But not everyone did this. Many people refused to part with their pets, and as the war went on, animals played an important role. The dogs were trained for civil defense. They were used as rescue dogs, sniffing through the rubble to find survivors. A dog named Rip, a stray, was credited with saving over 100 people. He was awarded the Dickin Medal, which was created in 1943 by Maria Dickin, founder of the PDSA charity, to be the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. His pigeons were also heroes. They were used to carry messages, especially from behind enemy lines. A pigeon named Winky flew 120 miles to bring back a message from a ditched aircrew, saving their lives. For ordinary people, a pet was a source of comfort. In a world that was chaotic and dangerous, the familiar presence of a dog or a cat was a connection to normality. They were part of the family. The mass observation archives contain many diary entries where people write about their fear for their pets during a raid. They would take their dogs into the Anderson shelter with them. They would share their rations. The bond between humans and animals became even stronger under the pressure of war. The initial panic was replaced by a grim determination to protect all members of the family, including the four-legged ones. How many rescue dogs were killed in the line of duty? Were there secret government programs to breed specific types of dogs for war-related tasks? What was the long-term psychological impact on the vets and animal shelter workers who had to carry out the mass euthanasia? Number 11. Can a garden be a weapon? A typical wartime photo might show a family, but they are not in their living room. They are in their back garden. And it's not a lawn, it's a vegetable patch. The father is digging with a spade. The children are holding carrots. This was the Dig for Victory campaign. It was one of the most successful home front campaigns of the war. The idea was simple. If people could grow their own food, it would reduce the demand on the nation's food supplies, which were threatened by a tax on shipping. The campaign was launched by the Ministry of Agriculture. They used posters, leaflets, and radio broadcasts to get the message out. The posters were simple and direct, a drawing of a boot pressing down on a spade with the words, "Dig for Victory." They encouraged everyone to turn any spare piece of land into a vegetable garden. Lawns, flower beds, parks, even the moat at the Tower of London were all dug up and planted with potatoes, cabbages, carrots, and onions. The results were incredible. The number of allotments or community garden plots rose from around 800,000 to over 1.4 million. It's estimated that by 1943, home gardens were producing over 1 million tons of vegetables a year. This made a huge difference. It meant more food was available, and it freed up shipping space for weapons and other essential materials. The campaign was not just practical, it was also good for morale. It gave people something positive and productive to do. There was a way for everyone, even the elderly and children, to contribute to the war effort. Gardening became a national obsession. People who had never grown anything in their lives were learning how to sow seeds and deal with pests. The Royal Horticultural Society published pamphlets on how to grow food in small spaces. There was a huge sense of community. People would share seeds, tools, and advice over the garden fence. It also changed the British diet. People ate far more vegetables than they had before the war. This, combined with rationing, contributed to the overall improvement in the nation's health. This focus on self-sufficiency extended beyond the garden. The Women's Institute WI played a crucial role in preserving food. They organized jam-making centers where surplus fruit from gardens and farms was turned into jam and preserves. This was a vital source of sugar and vitamins, especially during the winter. The WI became a highly efficient nationwide food production network. This movement, documented in publications like the Hum & Country magazine, showed the power of grassroots organization. The Dig for Victory campaign showed that a spade could be as important as a rifle. It was a war fought with soil and seeds, and it was a war that the people of Britain won in their own backyards. Were there secret government experiments to develop high-yield vegetable seeds to distribute to the public? How much of the food grown in public parks, like the royal parks, was secretly diverted to feed government officials and the military? What was the environmental impact of turning so many green spaces into cultivated land? Number 10, what did you do when your house was gone? There is a photo of a woman sitting on a pile of rubble. It used to be her home. She is holding a cup of tea. A member of the Women's Voluntary Service, WVS, has just given it to her. She looks dazed, shocked, but she is drinking the tea. This small act in the middle of total devastation was a lifeline. Over 200,000 houses were destroyed in London alone during the Blitz. So, what happened to the people who lived in them? They were called the bombed out. The immediate aftermath of a bombing was chaos. The ARP wardens and rescue squads would be at work, but close behind them were the support services. The WVS were famous for their mobile canteens. They would arrive with urns of hot, sweet tea and sandwiches. It was a small comfort, but it was vital. It was a human connection in a moment of despair. The sociologist Tom Harrison noted that the offer of tea was almost a ritual, a way of restoring a tiny bit of order and civilization. The first priority for a family who had lost their home was to find somewhere to sleep. The local authorities set up rest centers, usually in schools or church halls. Here, people could get a camp bed, a blanket, and some food. These were meant to be temporary, but finding a new home was difficult. There was a massive housing shortage. Some people were billeted with other families, an often uncomfortable arrangement where a family was forced by law to take in strangers. Others moved in with relatives crowding into already small houses. The government had to deal with the practical problems. How do you get new ration books if yours were destroyed in the fire? How do you get financial assistance? The Assistance Board was set up to provide emergency payments to people who had lost everything. They could get money to buy clothes and some basic furniture. But the bureaucracy could be slow and frustrating. People would spend days queuing at different offices trying to get the help they needed. This experience of navigating the system was documented in many personal diaries of the time, revealing a great deal of public frustration with officialdom. The psychological impact of losing your home was profound. A house is not just a building. It's a repository of memories. To see it all turned into a pile of bricks and dust overnight was a deep trauma. The social researcher Richard Titmuss wrote about the pathology of homelessness, the sense of dislocation and loss of identity that came with being bombed out. People would often return to the ruins of their homes for days, trying to salvage small personal items, a photograph, a piece of china, a child's toy. These objects became incredibly precious. They were the last tangible links to the life they had lost. What was the true rate of looting from bombed-out houses? And was it sometimes done by the emergency services themselves? How many people became permanently homeless and simply disappeared from official records? Were there secret plans to forcibly relocate large parts of London's population to other parts of the country if the housing crisis became unmanageable? Number 9, was it all just grim determination? We often see photos of people smiling, a group of women in a factory laughing during a break, a pub landlord pulling a pint in a half-demolished pub. The sign outside reads, "We are still open." This is the image of the Blitz spirit, the idea that Londoners faced the bombing with cheerful defiance. And it was true, to an extent, but it's not the whole picture. People needed an escape. They needed to laugh. Entertainment was vital for morale. The government knew this. They made sure that cinemas and theaters stayed open as much as possible. Going to the cinema was a hugely popular escape. For a few hours, you could forget about the war and lose yourself in a Hollywood movie. If the air raid siren went off during the film, a notice would appear on the screen. People could choose to leave or to stay. Most people stayed. The newsreels, like Path the News, were also a key part of the experience, showing heavily censored and optimistic versions of the war news. The radio was perhaps the most important form of entertainment. Almost everyone had one. The BBC became the voice of the nation. It provided news, music, and comedy. Shows like It's That Man Again, Itma, a comedy show full of surreal humor and catchphrases, were incredibly popular. Millions of people would listen every week. It was a shared national experience. Laughter was a powerful medicine. The comedian Tommy Hanley, the star of Itma, became a national hero. Dancing was another hugely popular pastime. Dance halls were packed. It was a place for young people to meet, to socialize, and to feel normal for a while. The mix of uniforms, British, American, Polish, and others, made the dance halls a glamorous and exciting place. The big band music of Glenn Miller was the soundtrack to many wartime romances. For a generation living with the constant threat of death, there was a sense of urgency, a desire to live life to the full. But beneath the surface of this determined fun, there was a lot of stress and anxiety. The Mass Observation Project recorded what people were really saying. They recorded complaints, rumors, and signs of fear. They noted that attendance at pubs went up. People were drinking more to cope with the strain. There was also an increase in what was called minor nervous disorders. The official history of the civilian medical services shows a rise in people seeking help for anxiety and sleeplessness. The Blitz spirit was real, but it was a coping mechanism. It was a brave face put on a very grim reality. People were not cheerful supermen. They were ordinary people, scared and tired, who were doing their best to get through an impossible situation. And sometimes the best way to do that was to have a pint, see a movie, or share a laugh in the dark. How much did the government secretly subsidize the film and entertainment industries to keep morale high? What was the real rate of alcoholism and other stress-related illnesses that was not officially recorded? Were there underground illegal nightclubs and gambling dens that thrived during the blackout? Number 8, what did a woman's hands look like? There's a photo of a young woman. She is wearing overalls and a headscarf. She is operating a large piece of machinery in a factory. Her hands are covered in grease. This image represents one of the biggest social changes of the war, the entry of women into jobs that had previously been done only by men. With millions of men joining the army, there was a massive labor shortage. The country needed workers for the factories, the farms, and the transport system. Women had to step up. In 1941, the government introduced conscription for women. For the first time, unmarried women between 20 and 30 were required to join the armed forces or work in essential industries. This was a radical step. The main options were the women's branches of the military, like the Auxiliary Territorial Service ATS or the Women's Auxiliary Air Force WAF or factory work. The factories were producing everything from bullets and shells to aircraft and tanks. The work was often dangerous and physically demanding. The hours were long, but the women proved they could do it. The most famous image is of Rosie the Riveter, which was actually an American campaign, but the British had their own version. Propaganda posters showed glamorous-looking women in overalls encouraging others to join the war effort. The reality was less glamorous. The work was noisy, dirty, and repetitive. Industrial accidents were common. But for many women, it was also liberating. They were earning their own money for the first time. They were learning new skills. They were part of a team contributing directly to the war. The historian Gail Brabon, in her book Woman Workers in the Second World War, describes this as a double-edged sword. The work was hard and often exploited, but it also offered new freedoms and opportunities. It wasn't just in the factories. Women took on roles as bus conductors, train drivers, and canal boat operators. The Women's Land Army was reformed, and thousands of land girls went to work on farms, plowing fields and milking cows to keep the country fed. They lived in basic hostels and did backbreaking work in all weathers. In the civil defense services, women served as air raid wardens, ambulance drivers, and fire watchers. They faced the same dangers as the men. This new role for women challenged traditional ideas about society. But it was not a complete revolution. Women were still paid less than men for doing the same job, and there was a constant double burden. After a long shift at the factory, a woman was still expected to do the shopping, the cooking, and the cleaning. Childcare was a major problem. The government was slow to provide nurseries, so women had to rely on friends and relatives. But despite the difficulties, the war showed what women were capable of. It was an experience that would have a lasting impact on the fight for equality in the decades that followed. How many women suffered from long-term health problems due to working with dangerous chemicals in factories? What was the true extent of workplace harassment and discrimination against women, and how was it covered up? Were there secret discussions in government about whether to send women into combat roles if the war situation became more desperate? Number 7, how do you fight a fire with sand? Look at a photo of a London street in 1940. There are sandbags everywhere, piled up in front of windows and doors, forming protective walls around important buildings. And on every street corner, there are buckets of sand and buckets of water. This low-tech equipment was the city's first line of defense against one of the most feared weapons of the Blitz, the incendiary bomb. The incendiary bomb was not designed to explode like a high-explosive bomb. It was designed to start fires. It was a small device, usually a magnesium canister, that would burn with incredible intensity. A single bomber could carry thousands of them. The plan was to drop them in huge numbers to overwhelm the fire services. The strategy was to turn the city into a sea of fire. The government knew this was a major threat. They launched a massive public information campaign to teach people how to deal with incendiaries. The main tool was the stir-up pump. This was a simple hand-operated water pump. It took a team of 2 or 3 people to use it, 1 to pump, 1 to aim the jet of water, and 1 to keep the bucket full. Every street was encouraged to have a fire watching party. Neighbors would take turns to be on duty at night, watching for the telltale glow of an incendiary landing on a roof. The advice was specific. You were not supposed to spray a jet of water directly onto a burning magnesium bomb, as this would cause it to explode violently. You were supposed to use the spray nozzle on the pump to cool it down, or to smother it with sand. People were told to keep buckets of sand and water in their attics. It was a terrifying prospect, a fire burning through your roof, and your only weapon is a hand pump and a bucket of sand. This civilian firefighting effort was vital. The professional and auxiliary fire services could not be everywhere at once. The historian A.J.P. Taylor noted that the success in fighting the fires was a key factor in London's ability to withstand the bombing. The night of December 29th, 1940 was the ultimate test. It was a low tide on the Thames, making it hard for the fireboats to get water. The raid was almost entirely with incendiaries. The resulting fires destroyed a huge area of the city. But thousands of fires were put out by ordinary people with their sandbags and stirrup pumps. Without them, the damage would have been far, far worse. The fire watchers became a part of the social fabric of the city. It was often a cold, boring, and terrifying job. You would sit on a rooftop all night, listening to the bombs and waiting, but it also created a strong sense of community. You were looking out for your neighbors. You were all in it together. It was a very personal and direct way of fighting back. How many fire watchers were killed or injured by falling from roofs or being hit by shrapnel? Were there any recorded cases of sabotage where fire watchers deliberately failed to put out fires? Did the government secretly know that the stirrup pumps were largely ineffective against newer types of incendiaries, but continued to promote them for morale purposes? Number 6. What was inside an Anderson shelter? A photo shows a family in their back garden. They are crawling out of a small curved structure made of corrugated iron, which is half buried in the ground. This was the Anderson shelter. For millions of people, this was their bedroom, their refuge, and the place they spent countless hours during the Blitz. It was named after Sir John Anderson, the minister responsible for air raid precautions. The government gave them away for free to poorer families. The design was simple but effective. It was made of 6 curved sheets of steel, bolted together at the top, with flat steel plates at the ends. It was designed to be partially buried in the garden, with earth piled on top. This made it very strong. It could withstand the blast from a nearby bomb. It could not take a direct hit, but very few things could. Over 2 million of them were distributed before and during the early part of the war. Life inside an Anderson shelter was cramped and uncomfortable. They were designed to hold up to 6 people. Inside, it was dark, damp, and cold. Water would often seep in, and condensation would drip from the curved roof. People would put in makeshift beds or bunks, a small table, and a candle or a paraffin lamp for light. The air would get stale and smelly, but it was safety. When the siren went, the family would grab their blankets and rush out to the shelter. They would listen to the sounds of the raid outside, the muffled crumps of the bombs, and the rattle of shrapnel hitting the iron roof. People tried to make them more homely. They would decorate the inside. They would bring in books or a pack of cards. Many people kept a shelter suitcase packed with essentials ready to go at a moment's notice. The experience of huddling together in the dark for hours on end brought families closer together, but it also caused a lot of friction. The historian and Blitz survivor Norman Longmate collected many personal accounts in his book How We Lived Then, which described both the camaraderie and the tension of shelter life. For people who didn't have a garden, there was the Morrison shelter. This was named after Herbert Morrison, the new Home Secretary. It was basically a heavy steel cage about the size of a dining table. The idea was that you could put it in your living room. You would sleep inside it. If the house collapsed, the cage was strong enough to protect you from the falling debris. Like the Anderson shelter, it saved many lives. These shelters were a constant physical presence. They were a part of the furniture of war. They represented a strange, new way of living, where your garden or your living room contained a little metal box that you hoped would keep you alive until morning. What was the real failure rate of Anderson shelters when a bomb landed very close by? How many people died from illnesses like pneumonia contracted from the damp conditions inside the shelters? Were there any cases of people being trapped inside collapsed shelters and not being found by rescue crews for days. Number 5. How do you stay healthy in a ruined city? A photo shows a nurse in a crisp white uniform. She is standing outside a first aid post. The window behind her is boarded up, but the post is open for business. Keeping the population healthy in the middle of the Blitz was a monumental challenge. The risk of disease was huge. Broken water mains contaminated the drinking water. Damaged sewers threatened to spread diseases like typhoid. And the crowded, unhygienic conditions in the public shelters were a breeding ground for infections. The healthcare system was put under incredible strain. Hospitals were a major target. Many were hit by bombs. The government had anticipated this. They had set up the emergency hospital service. This involved evacuating many patients from London to hospitals in the countryside. The London hospitals that remained had to be prepared. They sandbagged their lower floors. They moved operating theaters to the basement. Doctors and nurses had to perform surgery while the building shook from nearby explosions. First aid posts were set up all over the city in schools, halls, and shops. They were staffed by professional nurses and trained volunteers from organizations like the St. John Ambulance Brigade and the British Red Cross. They were the first stop for people with minor injuries from a raid. They dealt with cuts from flying glass, burns, and the effects of shock. They were a vital part of the civil defense system, reducing the pressure on the hospitals. One of the biggest fears was an epidemic. The Ministry of Health launched a massive public health campaign. Posters warned people about the dangers of contaminated water and encouraged them to boil all drinking water. There were campaigns to immunize children against diphtheria, which was a major killer at the time. The government also set up emergency feeding centers and mobile canteens to ensure people had access to hot food, which was important for both morale and physical health. The psychological toll was immense. People were dealing with constant fear, lack of sleep, and the trauma of seeing death and destruction. Doctors began to see a rise in what they called war neurosis. The symptoms were anxiety, depression, and uncontrollable shaking. However, the predicted wave of mass psychological collapse never happened. A study commissioned by the Ministry of Health, a study of an industrial city, which looked at the effects of bombing on Birmingham, found that while people were stressed, they were also remarkably resilient. People were more worried about practical things like housing and food than they were about their own nerves. The shared experience and the sense of purpose seemed to have a protective effect. The spirit of, we're all in this together, was a powerful psychological defense. How many medical records were lost in bombed-out hospitals, leading to long-term problems for patients? Was there a secret triage system where certain people were given priority for medical treatment based on their importance to the war effort? What was the true rate of suicide during the Blitz, and was it deliberately covered up by the authorities? Number 4, what did you wear when you had no clothes? In a photo from the time, a woman is looking at a shop window. The display is sparse. The sign in the window explains the new system, utility clothing. Like food, clothing was rationed. It was another daily reminder of the shortages and restrictions of wartime life. The system was introduced in 1941. Every person was issued with a clothing ration book containing a number of coupons. A dress might cost 11 coupons, a man's coat 16. The annual allowance was initially 66 coupons, but it was later reduced. This meant people had to choose carefully what they bought. It also meant that clothes had to be looked after. The government ran a campaign called Make Do and Mend. Leaflets and radio programs gave people tips on how to repair clothes, how to unpick old jumpers and reknit them, how to make a new dress out of a pair of curtains. Nothing was wasted. It was a time of great ingenuity. A woman might use parachute silk if she could get it to make underwear or a wedding dress. To deal with the shortages and to control prices, the government introduced the utility scheme. This was a range of basic price-controlled clothing, furniture, and other goods. The designs were overseen by a committee of leading designers, like Hardy Amies. The aim was to produce goods that were simple, functional, well-made, but used the minimum amount of raw materials. The clothes were identified by a special label, CC41, which stood for Controlled Commodity 1941. At first, people were suspicious of utility clothing. They thought it would be drab and uniform, but the designers did a good job. The clothes were simple but stylish. They featured sharp shoulders and narrow hips, a silhouette that became the defining look of the 1940s. The scheme was actually a great social leveler, because everyone had access to the same well-designed, affordable clothes. It became harder to tell the social classes apart by what they wore. The fashion historian Christopher Breward has written about how the utility scheme had a profound and lasting impact on British design, promoting a kind of democratic modernism. For women, trousers became much more common, not as a fashion statement, but for practical reasons. They were warmer and safer for working in factories or on farms. Because of the shortage of silk and nylon for stockings, women would sometimes paint their legs with gravy browning and draw a line down the back with an eyebrow pencil to simulate the look of seam stockings. It was a small act of defiance, a way of holding on to a sense of glamour and normality in a world of austerity. What was the scale of the black market in clothing coupons, and who was running it? Were certain textile factories secretly producing luxury, non-utility clothes for the rich and powerful? How many people suffered from health problems because they couldn't afford enough warm clothing during the harsh winters? Number 3, how do you tell the truth in a time of war? A photo shows a man pasting a large poster onto a wall. The poster has a bold, simple design. It might be a picture of a factory worker with the slogan "Back them up," or a warning about careless talk costs lives. This was the visual landscape of the war. Propaganda was everywhere. It was a crucial part of the fight, a battle for the hearts and minds of the people. The Ministry of Information, MOI, was the government department in charge of it. The MOI's job was complex, and it had to maintain morale, encourage people to support the war effort, and provide information, all without causing panic or revealing sensitive secrets. It used every medium available: posters, leaflets, radio, and film. The posters are the most famous legacy. They were designed by some of the best artists of the day, like Abram Games and Fougas. The messages had to be simple and powerful. They encouraged people to save fuel, to dig for victory, to not spread rumors. The Careless Talk campaign was one of the most famous, and it featured posters with drawings showing two people gossiping while a shadowy figure listened in the background. The slogans were catchy: "Keep it under your hat," "Be like dad, keep mum." The campaign was designed to stop people from accidentally giving away information that could be useful to the enemy, like the location of a factory or the movement of troops. And censorship was the other side of the coin. All news was carefully controlled. The MOI worked with the newspapers and the BBC to manage the flow of information. Bad news was often downplayed or delayed. For example, the full extent of the casualties in the Bethnal Green shelter disaster was not reported at the time. The government's justification was that it was necessary to maintain public morale. The writer George Orwell worked for the BBC during the war, and his experiences with the MOI's control of information heavily influenced his later novel, 1984. The relationship between the government and the people was not always smooth. The MOI was often criticized for being out of touch. Its early attempts at propaganda were seen as clumsy and patronizing. It took time for it to learn what worked. The social research from mass observation was a vital tool for the MOI. It provided feedback on how the public was reacting to different campaigns, allowing the ministry to fine-tune its messages. The historian Ian MacLean, in his book Ministry of Morale, charts this evolution, showing how the MOI went from a fumbling bureaucracy to a highly effective propaganda machine. The truth was seen as a weapon, something to be deployed carefully and strategically in the service of victory. What was the most significant piece of bad news that was completely suppressed from the public during the war? How many journalists and writers were secretly arrested or silenced for trying to report the truth? Were there secret black propaganda campaigns run by the government to spread disinformation among the British public for strategic reasons? Number 2, what does the morning after look like? There's a photo of a street in the morning. The sun is up, but the scene is one of devastation. A bus is lying on its side, its windows blown out. The road is covered in broken glass and debris. A building is just a shell, its front wall gone, revealing the rooms inside like a doll's house. And in the middle of it all, people are walking. They are picking their way through the rubble. They are on their way to work. This was the morning after the night before. The first thing you would notice was the smell. a strange, acrid smell of dust, soot, and gas from broken mains. The tinkle of broken glass being swept up, the shouts of the rescue workers, and the silence where a familiar building used to be. The landscape of the city could change overnight. A journey you made every day could suddenly be impossible, the road blocked by a mountain of rubble or a huge crater. The cleanup operation was massive and relentless. As soon as the all clear sounded and the fires were out, the work began. The Pioneer Corps of the Army, along with civilian rescue and demolition squads, would move in. Their first job was to search for survivors. Then they had to clear the roads. It was heavy, dangerous work. Unexploded bombs were a constant threat. A special bomb disposal unit had the terrifying job of finding and defusing them. For ordinary people, the morning after was about taking stock, checking on neighbors, assessing the damage to your own home, a cracked window, a hole in the roof. Everyone became an expert in makeshift repairs. They would patch up holes with wood and tar paper. They would replace broken window panes with cardboard or oiled linen. Life had to go on. Shops would open, even if their windows were boarded up. A sign handwritten on a piece of cardboard might say, "Business as usual," or, with a touch of defiance, "more open than usual." This daily routine of destruction and recovery is detailed in the diaries of people like Vera Hodgson, whose book, Few Eggs and No Oranges, provides a vivid, day-by-day account of life in London. She writes about the exhaustion, the dirt, and the sheer effort of trying to live a normal life. The morning after was a time of sadness and loss. But it was also a time of quiet determination. The task was to clear up, patch up, and get on with it. It was a resilience born not of grand speeches, but of the simple, repeated necessity of facing a new day. How many unexploded bombs from that period are still thought to be undiscovered under London? What was the true number of civilian deaths that were never officially recorded because the bodies were never found? Were there any areas of London that were secretly written off as unsalvageable by the government long before the bombing ended? Number one, can you get used to anything? Look at one final photo. It could be any of them. People queuing for a bus next to a crater. Children playing on a pile of rubble. A couple getting married in a church with no roof. What they all show is a strange and powerful human ability adaptation. After the initial shock and terror, the Blitz became the new normal. It became a part of the rhythm of life. This process of normalization is perhaps the most surprising thing about the whole period. Initially, the government had feared mass panic and a breakdown of society. Psychiatric experts had predicted huge numbers of psychological casualties. A report prepared for the Ministry of Health before the war, known as the Comedy on the Lessons of the Great War, predicted that psychiatric casualties would outnumber physical casualties by 3-1. This did not happen. The people of London proved to be far more resilient than the experts had believed. The psychiatrist WWII, who worked with children during the war, wrote about this phenomenon. He noted that people were able to incorporate the danger into their daily lives. They developed routines and rituals to cope. The trip to the shelter at night became as normal as making dinner. The sound of the siren became a familiar, if unwelcome, interruption. People became connoisseurs of destruction. They could tell by the sound how far away a bomb was. They would collect pieces of shrapnel the morning after a raid. This adaptation was a defense mechanism, but it came at a cost. The constant stress, the lack of sleep, and the poor living conditions took a long-term toll on people's health. The historian Jerry White, in his book The Londoners' War, uses oral histories to show the deep weariness that had set in by the end of the Blitz. People weren't cheerful, they were tired, they were fed up. The Blitz spirit was less about smiling through the bombs and more about a grim, stubborn refusal to be beaten. It was the spirit of endurance. The photos from this time are a record of that endurance. They don't show superheroes. They show ordinary people living through an extraordinary time. They show the fragility of a city and the strength of the people within it. They show that life, in all its mundane and messy detail, insists on continuing. People still fell in love, had babies, celebrated birthdays, and complained about the weather. They got used to a situation that a year earlier would have seemed impossible. They prove that human beings can get used to almost anything. And that is both a comfort and a terrifying thought. Did the government conduct secret psychological experiments to measure the limits of human endurance to stress and fear? What was the long-term multi-generational impact of the trauma on the children of the Blitz? Is there a hidden archive of photographs deemed too shocking for public release that shows a completely different, much darker side of life during this time?